Hello. Um,
Hello.
this is an interview with Olivia Sears, and I'm really happy that we finally come together because I had the pleasure to come to know Olivia also as a translator of some of my texts, and this has been a great experience. Let me present Olivia just briefly before we go on and talk about translation. She is the board president and founder of the Center for the Art of Translation, which is, I think, an interesting topic also to talk about. And she has also founded the journal Two Lines and was its editor for quite a long time. You studied, Olivia, at Yale, and then acquired a PhD in Italian literature at Stanford. So this is also interesting to know what you concentrated on. But as a translator, as a recent translator, you have been interested in avant-garde poetry by women poets. I mean, this is something very important, I think, for the Italian contemporary literature also. And you've translated Patrizia Cavalli, Tiziano Rossi, Chandra Livia Candiani, Patrizia Vicinelli, Maraccini, Maria d'Arezzo, e Ardennio Zofici. But at the same time, you have been very interested also in poets from the Renaissance, like Vittoria Colonna and Veronica Gambara. So this is quite an interesting span of writers. Before going into these interesting details, but maybe I've forgotten something, and Olivia, you would like to add something.
Well, I also translate the poet Eva Taylor, and I also translate Mariangela Gualtieri. I've been doing a lot of her work as well. So I guess I should update that bio because since that time, mostly I've been working on Eva Taylor and Mariangela Gualtieri. And I just had a book that I worked on for a long time by Ardennio Zofici just came out. It took a long time to produce because it has a very complicated format. So even though it's a book I finished translating many years ago, it took years to create the facsimile version of the book. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's about it.
So Olivia, you speak quite a lot of languages, and could we start from this point? I mean, which languages do you speak?
Well, I can read quite a few languages because when I was a child, I was exposed to Italian. I had family in Italy and environs, and when I first went to Italy, I became completely enamored of the language. I was from Los Angeles, where everything's very new, and in Italy, everything seemed like it was out of a fairy tale. And especially this notion of a language where people were communicating and my parents didn't understand them, and I found that fascinating. So I started when I was, I don't know, 9 or something. I started keeping a notebook of Italian words and trying to learn Italian. But living in Los Angeles, I could take Spanish, which I did, and I could take French, which I did. So I learned both those languages. But there was no opportunity to take Italian until I got to college. So, and I took an English class in which, of course, we read the Aeneid and the Odyssey, mm-hmm. because that's what we consider English. And we also read Dante, and I saw the facing text and I couldn't resist it. So then I jumped with both feet into Italian, but with a basis already in Spanish and French. Unfortunately, I never learned any German, so I can't be helpful in that way. But then about 30 years ago, I started playing. I'm also a musician, and I started playing Indonesian music, Indonesian gamelan music. And so I've played in an orchestra, an ensemble for 30 years. And I finally decided that I really needed to learn Indonesian, because being a translator and being around a culture where I don't know the language was just torture for me. So I've been learning Indonesian, Bahasa Indonesia, for many years now, 4 or 5 years. And I'm not yet, I think, at the place where I could translate on my own, but I work with another translator to translate some traditional poems that we use in our music that are sung, to translate those into English so that people at our concerts can understand what the songs are about. So really right now, my language focus is Indonesian and Italian.
Oh, fascinating. Because, I mean, somehow, as I understand you rightly, both languages are also, at least for my impression, connected with a musical experience. I mean, Italian is so much into the opera tradition, and language and music are so connected that this is also an important feature, I think, of Italian, and maybe also of Indonesian poetry.
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up, because growing up, I was fascinated with mathematics and with codes. And I was also a musician. And I think all of these things are really connected. Music is both the beauty of patterns that we hear, but it's also this interaction of patterns as a musician that you are paying attention to in the keys and so on. And I think that's always had a big effect on my my interest in the languages. In fact, between college and graduate school, I went to Bologna and I studied at DAMS. And the reason I went there was to study the interaction of text and music. And so I studied contemporary opera, and other uses of text with music. To me, that was the most fascinating. And I worked at the San Francisco Opera for some years. So really kind of exploring that relationship. So it's always kind of been in the background, even though I'm not a singer. I've always been fascinated by that, the combination of words and music.
Very fascinating. Also because poetry has a music, or languages have a music in itself. I mean, which somehow is different and sounds different. You know, coming from German, there is also quite a strong relationship between words and music, but it's a completely different type of sound that comes out. So, fascinating subject. I mean, maybe we talk about this, go deeper into it another time. I'm coming back to translation. When did you actually start to translate?
Well, I think it was during my junior year abroad, and I lived with a family. I was placed with a family in Florence, and the daughter there happened to be my age, and we found that we had a lot of similar interests. And she was also a musician, and she just loved Italian poetry. So she introduced me to Montale, Ungaretti, Pavese, all the great Italian poets of the 20th century. And we would spend time, her English was excellent, and we spent a lot of time translating those poems together into English roughly, just so that I would understand, since my Italian was just at beginner level. And then also translating the lyrics of American and English pop songs into Italian. We both had a great love for David Bowie at that time. And so that was I think there was a real excitement for me about that, just the effort it takes and this desire to always try to make it a little bit better, and it's never finished. And it just felt like the most interesting and engaging puzzle. And so then when I went back and lived in Bologna and attended the DAMS program, Dipartimento di Arte, Musica e Spettacolo, for those who don't know, at the University of Bologna, I started translating poetry, and I had a Spanish roommate from Barcelona who also was a translator. And so we actually compiled a number of texts, mostly from the Grupo 63. Mm-hmm. And together she translated the poems into Spanish, and I translated into Italian. And we would talk them through we communicated in Italian because that was our strongest language to communicate in. So we would discuss the poems in great detail and then go to our corners and translate into our languages, and then read each other's translations, trying to see if there was anything that we were missing. And it was such a thrilling experience to me. So I came back and went to graduate school hoping to study translation. But at that time, translation was very looked down upon in the academy. Mm-hmm. And I was told that it was not an appropriate avenue to study. And so I did as much as I could of my own translations during graduate school, and trying to incorporate translation into my essays and so on, but I was not allowed to study translation per se, or the craft at all.
Yeah, unfortunately, this is an attitude that I encountered as well. I mean, it has been seen for a long time only as a service,
yes,
and not as an art in itself. And I mean, only now it starts to get its recognition for what it really is, because it's actually not only a rewriting, it's something which goes very, very deep into a process of transmission of many, many aspects of culture and language and so on. So I often, from my own, think that translating is more difficult than writing, because it's you have a certain responsibility. Would you agree to that?
Absolutely. And in fact, I have found it so interesting seeing your when you have written poems in Italian and in German, the same poem essentially, but it's not a translation, but it's a retransmission in a certain way. And it's so interesting to see that as a translator, because of course I could never take the liberties that you took with your own text in transforming it, because I feel this obligation. But I do think that I think it's very important to keep in mind that the same process is happening. It's just happening differently. And we can't ever be, there's no such thing as loyalty to the original text. It's to the spirit of the text. And I like to show people those. I had my friend translate the German version of one of your poems that I had translated, and I like to show that to students of translation, to say, obviously you can't go quite this far because Eva was, starting this poem again, but just to see that translations are not word for word. No. They are translating the spirit of the text. And sometimes you want to push further and then, talk to your author and see how they feel about it. But I think that it is an art. And I think it's really important to recognize that, and that it's not a mechanical activity. It really requires a lot of your own creativity.
Absolutely. I mean, you develop an ear in a way. It's a bit like with music. I noticed this actually with my text, because being very close to Italian, I got a different relationship to, rhythm and rhyme, which in contemporary German poetry, okay, there's always rhythm, of course,
Right.
but rhyme is less, less present for many, many modern contemporary poets. And I have to say that through this connection with Italian poetry, where these two factors are somehow more important, still more important, I got a sort of, more courage to recuperate rhyme in German. And this is a very important experience, because it's, as you said, it's a spirit that comes back. It's a certain way of wanting maybe not to sing, but go into a dimension of words, which is less descriptive and less rational, but more linked to play with words and play with music and sounds. And this is, I think, really something that came to me through Italian and translating from Italian as well. But how do you choose your texts, actually? I mean, what is inspiring you when you want to translate something?
So early on, as you mentioned, I spent some time studying the Renaissance. That was what my doctorate focused first on. My interest was in how women poets responded to war. I had written a thesis on Montale's response to war as a Hermetic poet, but I felt the war was very present in his work. And then I was really interested in just studying women's writing in Italy. And I kept going back, and I found myself back in the Renaissance, where these women, the only women's poetry we have from that time came either from princesses or courtesans, because any other writing that there was, if there was any other writing, has been lost. And these women were writing about war, both from a public standpoint in terms of what war meant for Italy, but also from a personal standpoint, because their husbands and fathers and sons were dying in war. So it was very interesting to me, they used a Petrarchan model that is normally used for love poetry, and they used it for this political poetry. And I found that fascinating. So that sounds like a long digression, but my first interest was in poetry about war and violence, and how women respond to it. And then over time, I just became more interested in recuperating and finding all of the women writers of the 20th century who I felt had not been given sufficient attention. And there are not very many anthologies of Italian women writers. There are a handful. And so I had looked through all those, and I was familiar with all those poets. And it was very difficult to find in the annual Einaudi anthology was usually mostly men, and the same, handful of women would show up in those. And I actually got to a kind of crisis with Italian poetry where I thought, there's nothing happening right now that interests me, because it felt like a lot of the same kind of professorial poetry coming from the same group of men who have always been, at the top of the poetry scene in Italy. And so I started looking more deeply for women poets, asking booksellers in Italy about women poets. And I also looked for immigrant poets, because I thought they would have an interesting perspective, which is how I found your work. And very interestingly, I think it was the 2008 Nuovi Poeti Italiani that came out from Einaudi that was devoted entirely to women. And there was no presentation. The book looked exactly the same as every year's Nuovi Poeti Italiani. It didn't say anything about women on it. And it was just full of women poets. And that was absolutely, a game changer for me, because I found so many voices in there who are very well known, I think, in the poetry scene in Italy, of course, but had just not made it to the United States. So that was really exciting. And I've worked on a number of the poets from that anthology. And then, of course, I found your work on online magazines about immigrant writers, and the work that Mia LeCompte has done, and so on. And now I think, and it's interesting because I also try to ask the poets that I work with, who else do you think needs to be translated? And it's just interesting to see who people feel. You never know what voices are going to really speak to people, and especially in a contemporary context. So it's been really interesting, and interesting to see how an American audience responds to the work. And I've gotten tremendous responses about all the poets that I've translated as I send them to magazines in the United States. So
do you think there's also a generational difference between these new female voices? Because I mean, I suppose I don't remember actually who was in this anthologia from 2008, but I suppose there had also been poets from further from generations of the afterwar period. And
yes,
now there has been, I think in the last 20 years, there really has been an explosion of female voices. I mean, there are so many and so good ones. So do you have the impression there is a sort of, common line between these ones? Are there similar subjects?
It's interesting because a friend of mine just gave me a book by a young gay woman poet named Viola Lamoro, and her first poem opens with a quote from Mariangela Gualtieri. So you can see the connection. I definitely think there's been a renaissance, and I do find a connection. And what's nice is that I'm seeing the younger poets pulling further away from the kind of academic, intellectualized poetry that I was finding so frustrating. And I think that the women poets of an older generation have sort of pulled in that direction towards a much more lyrical, a much more feeling, a much more expressive poetry, that it just feels a lot more dynamic and raw and direct. Even the poetry that's very sophisticated lyrically and subtle, it feels a lot more lively. And I think the younger women are even pulling that in that direction further. So I think that's really exciting. It's how I felt about earlier periods of Italian poetry, and I'm just so glad to see these voices coming out, and I just am trying to translate as fast as I can.
Maybe these younger poets are also influenced by other languages. I mean, this is a feature which comes out more and more in modern Italian, that the influence of other contemporary poetry, which maybe hasn't been as strong before, because the Italian tradition is very strong. but very, very concentrated on its own patterns, as you pointed out. I quite agree with that. So,
and I do, I just, not to interrupt you, I just will add that I think one of the most important roles of translation is to bring those voices not just into the reading public, but also into the poets circle, so that these influences can be shared. A lot of the greatest poetry that we all love was the result of an Italian poet being exposed to a French poet who gave them a whole new view of what poetry could be, and vice versa. And I think it also changes the language. I think poetry translated from other languages into your language brings new vocabulary into your own language. So yeah, I think that's incredibly important.
Yeah. So, I mean, fascinating. I mean, with this work you've also done for your PhD, women and their writing about the war. It's quite topical in our times. And do you think, did you find something similar in modern female poetry?
I had intended to keep, I mean, obviously there's Emilio Rosselli is the most famous example of a poet who has written, during wartime with the effect of the war, bleeding into the poetry. But I definitely have found a lot of contemporary women poets sort of grappling with war and violence in a more general way. Gualtieri does this, Maria Grazia Calandrone does this, talking about conflicts in other parts of the world and the sort of war mentality in the world. I think recently, really a lot of that same passionate expression has been devoted to the environment and viewing our treatment of the environment as another kind of war. So, and I think I mean, I don't ever want to be essentialist about these things, but there are certain trends in the view of war where people in power might support a war because it achieves some kind of power objective, where people who are not in power view it merely as an opportunity to die and to lose their community and to lose, their families. In the past, that was much more along gendered lines because of the patriarchy. But it's still, to a certain extent, I mean, now we have certain countries that are the most powerful who will enter a war for some kind of gain, like Russia in the current times. That is not the invasion of Ukraine is not to defend the people of Russia. It's not to save the families of Russia from fascism or anything like that. It's purely about power and greed, in my view. So I think this is, I think there are always going to be voices of poets who want to decry this kind of behavior. And I think now it's not only women doing that. In the Renaissance, it was almost entirely women alone who were raising their voices against war and violence.
Mm.
Yeah.
Well, it's a very important subject. I think there are also different tradition in the different languages. It would be worthwhile also
Yes.
going deeper.
Another conversation. Yeah, yeah. Yes, and I was speaking only about Italy in that case, because things have been quite different in other countries. Yeah.
Yes, yes. Look, I wanted to know something about how you proceed when you translate, just on a very, I mean, down to earth level, on a practical level, as a sort of artigiana. Do you have? Can you describe how you start and go on and finalize your translation?
Yes, let's see. And I do also translate some prose, and it's somewhat different. But with poetry, I generally read through the poems and look for any unusual or unfamiliar words and mark them, and try to come up with a very, very rough first draft that just helps me think about where the poem is coming from, and try to get some of the spirit of it. I find that I've talked to a lot of translators about this, that you can read a poem and feel that you understand it, but when you start translating it, the level of understanding goes so much deeper, because you're really forced to try to come, instead of having a general sense of what the poem is saying, you're forced to come up with a way of re-expressing it. So then I also look for words that are really central to the poem, any words that seem to be embodying the essence of the poem or are repeated a lot. And I often will look at, I have, I don't know, dozens of dictionaries, Italian, just Italian dictionaries, and then Italian to English. And I'll look in all of those for synonyms, for different options. Using the dictionary as a thesaurus is incredibly valuable. If you consult enough dictionaries, you can have dozens of options for any one word. And so I like to have all of those at my fingertips, so that I can, when I'm reforming the poem, I can choose different words depending on their music. And then I'll try several different versions of the poem, using different vocabulary, to see if there's any hidden music or meaning that comes up from different versions. And often they'll be very different. That I'll do one that is extremely rhythmical, or one that has a little bit of slant rhyme or something. And then eventually, after I've come up with, sometimes I'll bring two versions, but at least one version we have a reading group of translators, and we work together and bring our work to each other. And then before I bring the poem to the poet, if I'm working with a living poet, I'll make sure that it's been read by a few people, to make sure I didn't ignore anything, or inadvertently create some kind of play on words in English that I didn't intend. And then I send the version to the poet. And now that I've done all this work, I know I have other options available if they feel that if they have doubts about anything, or don't feel that it has quite reached the I don't know, the result that we can both be confident with. Yeah, so that's my general method, and I find it absolutely riveting. I mean, I love every aspect of the process except revising. Revising at the very end is the most sort of tedious and the slowest aspect of the process. But it's just, I find delving into a text and really exploring it is really a joy. That's what brings me joy in translating.
And it also, if I understand you correctly, it also changes the relationship to English. I mean, to your mother tongue in a way, because you refine the instrument, you get deeper into English. Not only you understand Italian or another language better, you come closer to yourself in a way.
That's exactly right. And I find that translating, I do some of my own writing, mostly for art shows. I work with artists, and we do collaborations of visual and the text. And I find these phrases coming to me in Italian or from Italian poems that I've worked on for a long time in English, and different turns of phrase that I never would have thought of in English if it hadn't been suggested to me by the Italian poem. And I love that. I love that being kind of not haunted, but I have the presence of all these different voices, mostly Italian women and women who write in Italian, that are always with me. And I love that.
You ever come across a text or a poem where you had the feeling it's not translatable at all?
It's whenever people ask me that, I say, I think the most untranslatable work is Dante's Divine Comedy, and it's also the most translated Italian book. I think it's, for me personally, I never want to say something is completely untranslatable, but I think it's more that translating it would be less successful. And I did once want to translate a children's book that I read that had at the center of the book was constructed on a child's misunderstanding of a word, and they created their own word, and it had its own meanings and so on. And it was all based around this word play. And I tried for about a month of all of these different choices and talked to and finally the author and I agreed it'd stay in Italian. It just was not going to be worth the effort. So that it does happen sometimes with wordplay, that it is, it's very difficult to translate. But I think, the whole notion of the impossibility of translation, it's kind of like the impossibility of world peace or the impossibility of raising a child. These things are all, they seem impossible, and yet we keep doing them because we have to. So I think that's how it is with translation. We can't, it may be impossible to recreate the original, but that's not the goal. The goal is to bring this voice to more readers. And that's successful. So
very interesting. So, well, maybe we can come to a close. And I just maybe touch on this last point because it comes into my mind, the aspect of stylistic features that sometimes seem to be difficult to be translated. You mentioned this now with wordplay, but in Italian, sometimes there are quite tricky stylistic features, I think, for translation, at least into German, because of a different structure of words, composition of words. Maybe in English, this is also a problem, but maybe you encountered other things there, other difficulties from the point of view of stylistics.
Well, certainly, translating from Italian to English is difficult because of the use of gender and the word endings that, there are so much of the Italian language rhymes with itself, and English just simply does not. So those things are always difficult to transmit. And of course, one of the most difficult things in translation, besides humor and sex, which are very difficult to translate, one of the most difficult things is subtlety and nuance. So in Italian, of course, you can have entire sentences where no pronoun is used. There's just a verb, and you can tell from the verb form what person is, if it's the third person or the second person or the first person, but you don't necessarily know who it's referring to. And in English, we have to say, we can't just have a verb without a pronoun or without a name or something, a subject. So that is, you can lose some subtlety in those kinds of translation situations. But I think I just come back to the fact that translation is it's like an artistic puzzle, and I love puzzles. So it's very challenging, but I feel like there's always some kind of solution, and it may not be perfect, but I feel I just have a particular passion for translation, and I feel kind of a mission to bring more voices to more people. And yes, of course, you're taking a writer with their culture and their whole context and trying to bring it into another culture, and it's going to be a different thing, and that will be true stylistically as well. But I just think it's an incredibly challenging and exciting task.
It is, I quite agree. Thank you, Olivia. Do you think you want to add something that we missed out maybe in this little conversation about translation? Problem with my life.
I think I don't think so. I think I'm just so delighted that there are people who want to talk about translation. It's something I've been devoted to for a long time, and I will say, please check out the Center for the Art of Translation online, catranslation.org and Two Lines Press, because we have translations of poetry and prose online for free from all over the world that we've published over the last 30 years. So we have an online journal and a whole database, so you can put in the language that you're interested in, and all the work we've published will come up. So I really just want more people to be aware of translation and of the artistry that goes into it, and of this beautiful work that we can read from around the world. It really makes you feel a lot less isolated in the world.
I think this is a very, very good last sentence. Thank you very much, Olivia.
Thank you so much, Ava. This has been a real joy, and especially to meet you finally.